In the years after its abandonment, workmen at an old hospital kept washing strange symbols off the walls. The next morning, they'd reappear, sometimes as completely different images. This wasn't graffiti or vandalism. These symbols seemed to manifest from nowhere, carved deep into horsehair plaster that had been painted over decades ago. The Taton State Hospital had been closed for years, but something was still very much alive inside those crumbling walls. But what hides within those walls remains unsolved. To understand the true horror of this place, you need to know how it all began. The hospital's dark beginning. In 1854, the Taton State Hospital opened its doors as the State Lunatic Hospital. The building stood tall and imposing, promising hope for the mentally ill who had nowhere else to turn. But behind the medical facade lay something much darker. Just less than a mile away at Mayflower Cemetery sat a potter's field filled with numbered graves, row after row of unmarked stones stretched across the earth. Each number represented a patient who had simply vanished from the records. No names, no families notified, just cold numbers carved into cheap headstones. The message was clear. Patients could disappear here without a trace. The hospital's basement became the stuff of nightmares among staff members. Workers would gather in hushed groups, sharing stories about things they couldn't explain. Night shift employees reported hearing sharp knocks echoing from empty rooms that would grow louder and more insistent, followed by footsteps thundering down deserted hallways when no one else was around. Patients told their own disturbing stories. They described shadows that moved independently across the walls, sliding between rooms like liquid darkness. These weren't tricks of light or medication side effects. The shadows left physical evidence behind. Strange marks scratched into the horsehair plaster walls that maintenance crews couldn't explain. Here's where it gets even creepier. Rumors began spreading through the hospital about a satanic cult that had somehow gained access to the building's darkest corners. Staff members would arrive for their shifts to find evidence of strange rituals performed in the basement overnight. Symbols appeared on walls that had been stripped back to their original horsehair plaster, not drawn with paint or chalk, but carved deep into the material itself. The text that accompanied these symbols was completely illegible. No one could identify the language or decipher the meaning. Maintenance workers would paint over the markings, only to find them returned by morning. Sometimes they'd discover entirely different symbols in the same locations, as if something was actively changing them. By 1975, the main building was finally abandoned. The last patients were transferred out. The final staff members locked the doors behind them. But the supernatural activity that had plagued the hospital for over a century wasn't finished. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger without human interference. The building sat empty, but it wasn't truly alone. And for those who dared to enter, they would soon discover that some residents had never left. The Shadow Man and Supernatural Encounters. Among all the reported paranormal activity at Taunton, one entity stood out as particularly terrifying. Patients called it the Shadow Man. This wasn't just a glimpse of movement in peripheral vision or a trick of dim hospital lighting. Multiple patients described the same disturbing figure appearing in their rooms night after night. The Shadow Man appeared as a short male figure that seemed wrong somehow. Sometimes he looked stretched out of proportion, as if someone had pulled his body like taffy. Patients would wake to find him standing in their doorway or creeping across their floor. But what made these encounters truly horrifying was where he would position himself. The Shadow Man had an unsettling habit of clinging to walls and ceilings. Patients would look up to find him pressed against the ceiling directly above their beds, staring down with an intensity that made their skin crawl. He would glare at these already vulnerable people, adding another layer of terror to their daily struggles. The fact that multiple patients reported identical experiences made it impossible to dismiss as hallucinations. But the Shadow Man wasn't the only supernatural resident making life miserable for everyone inside those walls. Remember those mysterious symbols that kept reappearing on the horsehair plaster? They weren't the only things manifesting in the darkness. Hospital work crews cleaning the walls also reported encounters with a spider-like apparition that roamed the halls, manifesting wherever it pleased. Staff members described this creature appearing suddenly in corridors, examination rooms, and patient areas. The sight of this thing skittering across floors and walls left employees too frightened to work alone during night shifts. Even after the hospital closed in 1975, paranormal investigators who gained access to the building continued documenting these same unexplained phenomena. The supernatural activity seemed to intensify rather than diminish, as if the spirits were no longer constrained by the presence of living patients and staff. What makes these encounters even more chilling is that they weren't isolated incidents scattered across decades. They formed a clear pattern of activity that remained consistent throughout the hospital's operation. The Shadow Man, the changing symbols, the spider creature. They all became permanent fixtures of daily life at Taton State Hospital. But perhaps the most disturbing part wasn't the supernatural activity itself. It was how desperately some people seemed to want these stories buried forever. The cover-up that raised more questions. When true crime writer Sue Coletta decided to investigate Taunton State Hospital, she expected to find an abandoned building with a spooky history. What she didn't expect was the human resistance she would encounter. Instead of finding empty hallways and dusty rooms, Coletta encountered staff members who acted suspiciously defensive. They seemed determined to prevent her from documenting what she found. Their behavior was immediately striking. These weren't casual security guards doing routine checks. They acted like people protecting something important. Despite being told that photographs were strictly forbidden, Coletta noticed something odd. There was no posted rule anywhere indicating this restriction. The staff's reaction was unusually intense for a supposedly empty building. Their responses felt personal and urgent, as if her presence threatened something beyond basic property rules. She decided to take pictures anyway. The moment she raised her camera, plain-clothed guards appeared seemingly out of nowhere. These weren't uniformed security personnel making their rounds. They followed her movements carefully, communicating with others via phone and reporting her exact location throughout the grounds. The level of security and surveillance for an abandoned hospital raised serious questions about what exactly they were trying to protect. Why would an empty building require such intense monitoring? What could possibly be so sensitive that it needed this kind of protection decades after closure? Even more unsettling was the staff's behavior when Coletta asked about specific former patients. When she inquired about a particular female serial killer who had been treated there, the secretary's response was telling. "We're not even allowed to discuss her," she said. Imagine hearing that in an empty hospital. This wasn't just professional discretion. It was active suppression of information. The secrecy extended far beyond patient confidentiality rules. Staff members acted like people who were genuinely afraid of what might be discovered. Their reactions suggested they were protecting more than just medical records or property values. After a 2006 fire, the governor of Massachusetts ordered all buildings within the fence to be completely torn down. This wasn't routine demolition of old structures. The timing and thoroughness of the destruction effectively erased any physical evidence that might have answered lingering questions about the hospital's history. The aggressive attempt to control access and information only added to the mystery. Normal abandoned buildings don't require this level of secrecy and surveillance. Why would the state go to such lengths to erase every trace? In conclusion, Taunton State Hospital's darkness lingers long after its walls fell. The combination of documented paranormal activity, suspicious cover-ups, and the ultimate destruction of evidence creates a mystery that may never be fully solved. What truths were buried with those walls? And who, if anyone, survived their secrets? The questions about the alleged satanic cult and those unexplained markings died with the building's demolition, but the stories refused to disappear completely. They live on in the testimonies of former patients, staff members, and investigators who witnessed things that defied explanation. Next time you see an abandoned hospital, remember, some places never sleep. If this chilled you to the bone, hit like and subscribe for more real-life hauntings that will make you question what's really out there.